Hello and welcome to our third webinar in this series from the Cognitive Decline Partnership Centre. And today we're looking at supported decision making for aged care providers. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on today and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today in the webinar. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Cognitive Decline Partnership Centre for funding this webinar series, and Redback, who are the platform that we're using. So if you're unfamiliar with the platform that we're on today, you'll notice that there is a comments box in the corner of your screen, and please do enter your questions as we're going along, and we'll look to answer those towards the end of the webinar. And also, if you have any technical issues, please let the team know and they will be able to assist you. I'm very happy to introduce our two guest speakers today, Kathy Williams from the Dementia Australia Consumer Network and Helen Levitch from Helping Hand Aged Care and the Research and Development Unit there. And both of these two people have been heavily involved in our project on supported decision making. And so they'll be offering perspectives from a consumer point of view and also from an aged care provider point of view. Now, our goal today is to look at the issues around supported decision making from the point of view of people who are in receipt of aged care, and we're very clear here that this refers both to aged care in the community and also the residential aged care setting. And this is, as I said before, the third of 3 webinars. So if you haven't been able to be part of the first 2, I'd encourage you to have a look at those which are recorded and up on our project website, which is linked there at the bottom of the screen. And also there's a number of other resources that you can access there, including some videos, a consumer guidebook and a policy guidelines document. Our project has been exploring supported decision making in the context of dementia, and of course dementia and aged care are not synonymous, but we do know that people who are in receipt of aged care, that often dementia or cognitive impairment is an issue, and that's one of the things that we'll be looking to explore in the webinar today. So just to provide a brief overview, the webinar will cover a very brief revision of some of the content from the previous webinars around understanding what supported decision making is, how it's relevant to the aged care setting. We'll have some personal stories and try to understand those in the context of our supported decision making work, and then start to look at some of the organisational factors that might actually influence the implementation of supported decision making. So there's some research that we'll present based on analysis of aged care provider policies, and also interviews with staff in aged care who talk about some of the factors that either help or hinder in the implementation of supported decision making. There's obviously very important issues around risk, and we've got a topic at the end on navigating risk, and would also like to invite you to ask any questions, and we'll do our best to answer those as well. Okay, so this slide is just a very brief revision of some of the material that's been presented in more detail in the previous webinars, particularly webinar 2, where we explored the actual process of how do we go about supporting a person's decision making. We do have a definition of supported decision making from the United Nations, and basically it would translate into a number of principles that we could understand in a practical sense about supported decision making being a voluntary process, that it's about the person's own decision and having assistance to make decisions and to communicate your decisions about matters that affect your own life. So, for example, assisting a person to understand their options, to weigh up these options and to communicate their choice. More broadly, it also looks at developing a person's ability to make decisions and creating enabling contexts, and that's something that's come through in some of the consumer stories that we've had in our webinar series so far about the importance of creating enabling contexts for a person in their decision making. I've just had a comment come back that the audio is a little bit muffled for some people, so we'll just I'll just continue, and we'll just be dealing with that. Thanks for the comment. So in the consumer guidebook that we've promoted through the project, we do outline a step-by-step approach, and this approach, rather than being, if you like, a tick box sort of sequence where you tick off step 1 and then go to step 2, it's really more a series of considerations that would apply at different stages of a decision-making process. So what we would need to think about when we're looking at, well, what decision are we making here? How do we prepare for that decision? What's the optimal way of communicating in the context where someone needs some decision-making support? How do we enable choice and enable choosing? And how do we put that decision-making into practice and then review and follow up? So that's dealt with, again, in much more detail in webinar 2, but I just wanted to revise it here so that you have that, that information, as we'll refer to it a bit today. And there's also a number of key values that have come out of our research. So these are values around inclusion, knowing and understanding the person, respect for their rights, dignity, and adapting to change or maintaining flexibility in the process. So that's just a very brief revision on what we mean when we're talking about supported decision making, and a bit of a process for how we go about that supported decision making. And I'd now like to ask Kathy Williams to share with us a personal story from her own experience about caring for her mother, and then we'll come back and revisit this model.
Hi, I'd like to just share with you some stories that relate to my mum, Maureen. Mum had, for most of her life, bipolar disorder, and when she was about 71, she was diagnosed with dementia, and because she lived on her own and I had a family of young children in 2006, she went to live in residential aged care. And I guess my mum, while she had mental health issues, she was a very theatrical person. She loved people. She loved being around people. But she ended up, living in a unit on her own, and she was quite isolated. When she did go into residential aged care, she enjoyed being around people, and she while she kind of wanted to go home, that wasn't an option, and she lived there for about 5 years, and she died in 2011. I just wanted to share with you some stories that kind of highlight where supported decision making might have been useful if we had taken that approach back then. Mum, when she lived in her unit, she loved having the curtains open, and she loved looking out into the tree, out to the trees. And when she was in her room in aged care, the staff would open the curtains. Mum got very anxious about that and very annoyed that the curtains were open, and I would go in and say to Mum, but you love looking out into the trees, and you need to have the curtains open. And I guess on reflection, finding the fact that Mum didn't really have a say in whether she wanted the curtains open or not, took away her ability to even have control over, probably one of the only things that she could control in an institution was whether the curtains were open or not. Another story that comes to mind was when she first moved into the facility, I, as her only daughter and relative, got sent a good palliative care plan and was asked to fill it out. And for me, that was, quite confronting. And I thought it might be confronting for many other people if that was their standard practice. And my mum was very clear about her wishes. She had appointed me as her a substitute decision maker before she went into care, and she was very clear about her wishes. She was clear that she didn't want any extraordinary measures, and that when it was her time that she was happy to die. And so to get the palliative care plan in the mail was quite a shock, and I suggested to the facility that perhaps a better approach would be to have a family meeting where my mum and I would be able to sit down and talk with the nurse about what her wishes might be. And during that meeting, it became really obvious that there wasn't a lot of supported decision making going on from my perspective or the facility's perspective, and Mum was quite anxious about it, and she was quite it wasn't a very good experience for her, so we ended up having to cut short the meeting. And I guess the final story that I want to share is the fact that my mum ended up having a good death. She died one night after dinner in her bed. Quite a surprise, because I thought things were going quite well for her, and I was a bit concerned that her body might outlive her brain. She still recognised me as her daughter, but she found it difficult to have conversations, and her quality of life probably wasn't as good as what she would have had liked. She still had a twinkle in her eye, and she still had the kind of banter with the staff. But because Mum died very inconveniently on the 2nd of January, there was no doctor around to sign her death certificate, so we had to, and she wanted to be donated to the body donation program, so we had to, they had to hand the case over to the coroner. And it was on receiving the coroner's report that I had found out that Mum was on all these medications that I wasn't aware of. I wasn't aware that she had high blood pressure, and I wasn't aware of a number of different things. Yet I was her substitute decision maker, and I guess I was quite shocked to think that. And I knew that I knew that the facility didn't really take a supported decision making approach, and that I was her decision maker, and I was concerned that all these decisions were being made, and I wasn't aware. So they're kind of my stories from my mum's perspective and my perspective going back some years. Like I said, Mum died in 2011, and I know that in terms of supporting people to make their own decisions, things have moved on quite a lot.
Thanks, Kathy. That's really helpful. So just in terms of making a few comments on Kathy's story and the experience that she's shared there, some of the things that come out of that story, of course, is the need to recognise that people have differing levels of decision-making ability at different times, and that a person may be able to be involved in some decisions, even if not all decisions. And so the story about that I guess that letter being sent out to you, Kathy, reflected, from what you said, I guess an assumption that your mum couldn't be involved herself in speaking for what she wanted at that time. And as we'll come to later, the way that organisational systems can, in an unintended way, take us away from that nuanced and person-centred approach and more towards a systematic approach or a one-size-fits-all, is something that we have to be careful of. And it strikes me, I guess, that the considerations around what are the important decisions that need to be made here, and the preparation for those decisions, is something that was also neglected in the case that you talked about as well. So those are some of the things that we do try to draw attention to in setting up a supported decision-making approach that would be safe for the people who are involved. And finally, because supported decision-making does understand that people do differ in their levels of decision-making ability, and that as a last resort, substitute decision-making will be needed in some cases, it was, of course, a shock, I guess, for you to realise that medications had been prescribed and you hadn't been notified or given consent as a substitute decision-maker. Yeah. So thanks very much for sharing that. It gives a good context to what we're talking about today in the aged care environment. I'd like to introduce Helen Levitch now, who's going to explain, I guess, some of the organisational factors that feed into supported decision-making and how they might explain some of what happened in this situation.
Thanks, Craig, and hello to everyone. The reflections we had as a group on that, on those stories, were to consider why it happens in organisations that, despite our best intentions, and most organisations, most aged care staff in residential and community do this work because they want to make things right, do good for people. But there are a lot of things that surround us in our environment that can force us or push us down paths, and we wonder how we got there. How did we not understand that someone wanted to have their curtains left closed? How did we miss, or how did we just suddenly send letters out to everybody? How did we miss getting consent in a proper way around medication, if those are the things? There are a lot of systems and processes that come into place when you're in institutional settings where, if we're talking residential, where things just start to happen because it's easy, it's efficient, we've got limited resources, things have to be done within certain times. And those imperatives can sometimes start to override those greater considerations of, have I talked to the person about this? Something like sending out the palliative care plan to everybody, probably efficient from our perspective, and I can see the conversations happening. Let's send it out to everybody, because then everybody's got it. We've got a KPI about 100% compliance with having these directives in place, which are all good things, but then we've forgotten to think about from the other end, or not thought through how we could make that happen better. We live in a fairly challenging environment, and in terms of resourcing for aged care, and also the different expectations from regulation, and I think a lot of organisations and particularly staff live in a world where they fear, if I do this or I don't cover that thing off, something bad's going to happen through accreditation or failing to meet some legal requirement. These things also can start to put organisational, structural, institutional factors as a priority around the decisions that might be made. There are a lot of things around the attitudes and cultures that come into aged care and institutions as well that can impact on our ability to respond perhaps in a more considered and supportive approach to decision making. Sometimes there's we already do that, we already do supportive decision making, because when I walked in the room this morning, I just said, would you like your curtains opened, and opened the curtains without necessarily waiting for it to happen. Or I already think I might help people have conversations about risk, or that they want to go and watch the movie this afternoon, because the way I do this is I say, would you like to do that? And they say, oh yeah. Have I really supported that conversation, or have I just made the assumption that it's easier? There's also not necessarily a lot of experience amongst our staff or our organisational settings in how you engage with the older person and with their family in a way that allows you to have conversations and which respects the rights of that family or that individual to have some agency in what happens to their life, which is something we'll talk more about when we're talking about risk as well. One of the big challenges we face in getting across new ideas, like something like supported decision making or true consumer and carer engagement, is the breadth of the skill base and the knowledge base in our organisation. We have highly, highly competent and experienced nurses through to the Certificate 3 aged care worker who started last week, all of them working with us. In our organisation, we work across the whole of the metropolitan area of Adelaide and through really quite dispersed rural areas from Bullaroo Centre in the mid-north through to Port Lincoln on the Eyre Peninsula. And we might have staff who only work for us a few hours a week in community settings. How do we get across to those staff complex ideas like supported decision making? And then how do we also work with all the carers and consumers who live in those environments? So those factors can influence our ability to be able to say that everybody everywhere understands what things should go into place when we're talking about, do I open people's curtains or not. That being a kind of emblematic story that we're using to describe this. And I've already touched on all those external factors and whatever, but if we're to do, even if we as an organisation or our staff did supported decision making well, and we'd work to enable older people themselves and their family carers to understand supported decision making, the GP or the specialist might walk through the door and not do that at all. So we have that environment to work with as well. All of these compounding factors can make it difficult for us to truly enact a supported decision-making approach. Thanks, Craig.
Thanks, Helen.
Back to you.
Thank you. So I think there's some really good insights into some of the practical limitations and also the systemic limitations that can challenge something like supported decision-making. So that's really what we want to address in the next section of the webinar today. And the way that we've tackled this in the project that we're talking about here is that we certainly have put some effort into developing training packages for the aged care sector, but I think there's been a really strong recognition as well that if you train staff without working on the systems and policies within which they operate, then it can be difficult for those changes to be implemented, and it can be very frustrating for the staff who come away with new knowledge but feel, I guess, bound by systems that they're working within. So that prompted a component of our project around looking at the policies of aged care providers, and in order to look at those policies, we framed this analysis within the Australian Law Reform Commission's National Decision-Making Principles, which were established in 2014 as recommendations. And these really provide a basis for Australia's response to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and how that might feed into future law reform across Australia. So that it's understood will influence the process of future law reform around legislation like the Aged Care Act and like the legislation relating to the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So there is more detail around these national decision-making principles in the first webinar, but I've just put them up here for a bit of a revision for those who haven't seen that webinar. And basically it outlines these principles that says all adults have an equal right to make decisions that affect their lives and to have those decisions respected. And that persons who require support in decision-making must be provided with the access to that support necessary that they can make, communicate and participate in those decisions. Importantly, the third principle around will, preference and rights introduces new language here, and this comes to us from the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And it says that the will, preference and rights of persons who require decision-making support must direct decisions that affect their lives. I think this is a really critical one because it directs us as to how we need to engage, as Helen was saying, with consumers and carers to understand what a person's will and preference is, and also that if we are using substitute decision making, that even in those situations that the will, preference and rights of persons who have that substitute decision making happening should be directing those decisions. And finally, of course, that the laws and legal frameworks contain appropriate and effective safeguards for these people, including to prevent abuse and undue influence. So this is shown here really as the framework for that policy analysis, and there's an audit tool and a set of criteria that come out of that framework, and it's available in the policy guidelines document that I'll show you later. So if there's organisations out there who want to undertake this policy analysis themselves and do a self-assessment, you can use that criteria to do that. I'll be sharing the results from the study that we did where we developed this framework. So the study that we did, we invited aged care providers from across Australia to submit their policies for a confidential analysis and for confidential feedback that was tailored to their own situation. What we have shared today is the aggregated data, and it's de-identified. You'll see there's 7 organisations who agreed to participate, and that a number of the key staff in those organisations also agreed to be interviewed. So that's where it says P1, P2, P3, and so on. So 9 people were interviewed, and some of them were disability service providers. All of them provided both residential and community aged care, and some of them were small and some large. We defined size based on having 10 or more residential facilities. Interestingly, they were all not-for-profit facilities, so that might feed into the results that we've collected, and I guess we need to be cautious about generalisations based on this small sample. When we used the framework and analysed the policies that were sent to us, we were looking at policies around healthcare and lifestyle decision making, and we had a number of specific criteria that related to each of those policies. So one of them was about whether there was a specific published policy on assessing decision-making capacity. As you can see there, 3 out of the 7 organisations had a specific policy on this area. For other organisations, it was either not mentioned explicitly or it was more ad hoc, so it was mentioned across a number of other policies and sometimes inconsistently across those policies. All of the organisations referred to the current state-based legislation for substitute decision-making, and I think that's really important because that provides a day-to-day legislative framework for how substitute decisions are made, particularly in the basis of healthcare decisions. And all of the organisations also had high-level statements, so they acknowledged that care recipients did have rights to make decisions and to receive support. But when we looked at this in more detail, it was very rare to see any specific guidance on the nature of this support. So, for example, 0 out of 7 referred specifically to supported decision-making or explained how you go about supported decision-making. Now, I mentioned Principle 3 about the will, preference and rights directing decisions, and as you can see there, 0 out of 7 organisations fully met the domains or criteria under that principle. And that could be understood in the sense that this is new language and it's and they're new concepts to some extent. But I think there is certainly some room for exploration and trying to understand why that is the case and what can be done about that. And finally, when we look at the domains under Principle 4 and the safeguards, these were also typically not met or partially met, except for the one particular criteria that was around restraint, and that was fully met by 6 of the 7 organisations. Now that becomes interesting, I think, because we have existing policy guidance through a document that's a high-level document that's been released by the Commonwealth Department of Health, and there's been sustained regulatory attention on that area for a number of years, and so that perhaps points us in the direction as to how we can understand why some of these areas haven't had met these criteria. And it really prompted us as to the need to provide some guidance for the aged care sector on these issues, which you'll see we deal with a bit later in the session. So I'm turning now to some of the interviews which help us to understand a little bit more about why the analysis came out this way, and also these interviews recognise that in some cases there is a gap between policy that's stated and actual practice, and so the people who were interviewed gave us a good understanding of the real day-to-day practice of the challenges around implementing policy in this area. One of the issues was about the organisational context, and as you can see from the quote here, the person is saying that these problematic cases might become more prevalent as time moves on because aged care is changing for a whole range of reasons. The people in it are changing, the families that are attached to these people are changing, aged care is changing in response, and the government are also changing it by the way they're changing the funding. So this is referring, I think, to the challenges around aged care being a very dynamic sector at the moment. A lot of influences are coming from different directions, and that presents some challenges, I guess, in terms of implementing new policy. Another theme that arose from the interviews was around the approach to policy development. Some people referred to the idea of, or a philosophy, if you like, of a rigorous and transparent approach to policy development, as opposed to an agile and values-based approach. So one of the quotes here from one of the participants says that their organisation has a philosophy of being flexible and agile in terms of meeting individuals' needs and taking risks for people in order to meet those needs. So if we don't need a policy to ensure that we meet a regulation of some description, we tend not to have it. Now that's one point of view, and I think it's not just a black or white thing. Organisations would have exist on a spectrum, I think, when it comes to this theme. But what we're seeing there, I guess, is from some people's point of view, the importance of having this very clearly laid out so that things are rigorous and transparent and everyone knows where they stand. And in other cases, some organisations saying that actually we need to avoid being too prescriptive here, because that can actually become a barrier to being agile and taking risks for people and really having a person-centred approach. So there's, I guess, a little bit of conflict there between the ways that different people have explained their approach. When it comes to actually implementing policy, there was a lot of factors around the approach to change management. So this person said, I suppose it's about when policies are reviewed or looked at, because there's only a few people that are involved in it, some other areas of the business aren't represented in those discussions, and then they might go, well, this doesn't work for us. So they'll just develop their own sub-procedures to manage it. And I think there's a danger in that. And so when we think about this from a point of view of change management, it's one step perhaps to make a change in a policy, in the text of a policy, but there's a whole journey that then goes on afterwards to implement that policy, and where the views are being sought from within the organisation, or who's along for the ride, if you like, can really influence how well that policy is then taken up and adopted by staff across the organisation. Of course, participants also mentioned the resource challenges that are impinging on these areas as well. So for this participant, they identified that there's still a real challenge about allocating the resources to meet this, sometimes the external policy or idealistic view. I think we, in terms of the aged care sector, share it, and we want it, but we don't really have the means to achieve it. And for us, that can sometimes be quite demoralising as a sector. So I think this reflects the view that while there's an understanding of the human rights basis of supported decision making and a recognition that this is something that we need to move towards, it's also something that has resource implications as well, and workforce implications in terms of who do you employ, how do you employ them, how do we meet people's needs in terms of supporting their decision making. I think one reflection on this that's really interesting has come out of some of our consumer perspectives on supported decision making, where they've helped us illustrate that it's actually not about sitting right beside a person the whole way through a decision-making process, and that it doesn't have to be seen as this very long and arduous process, because, as some people have told us in our other research studies, that can actually create a fair bit of tension and almost make you feel uncomfortable if you're being sort of crowded in decision-making. And so some people have talked about that a more ideal approach is really to know what information needs to be gathered and to provide some information, but then to step back and give people time as well. And so there is the potential that by looking at supported decision making differently, we can actually address some of these resource challenges. And finally, there's some quotes here around what I felt was an overarching theme that really helped us to understand the different responses, and that was this idea of a preemptive approach that actually takes a proactive stance and looks to preempt decision-making dilemmas, versus that response that's about waiting until something happens and then responding. So, for example, if we look at participant 6 here, and this participant was responding on behalf of an organisation who met a very large number of the criteria and probably performed the best, if you like, in terms of our policy analysis. That participant really talked about a preemptive approach. So referring to programs that they have, such as if the residents want to go out, that they have the right to go. We don't lock people up or restrain people because they might be at risk of leaving the building. We'd say, well, we'll get a volunteer to go with them for the walk and let them go. So in this case, the fact that there's been thought put into the service model and a preemptive approach has then actually avoided the need for that decision-making dilemma, because there's a way of responding if it ever does emerge. And later on, the participant says, I operate an open door policy, so the residents can come and speak to me at any time, and they do. And I suppose it's having that sort of relationship where you can then open up the more difficult discussions if you need to. So what this is suggesting, I guess, is that by knowing and understanding people and developing relationships, we then place ourselves in a position where we can actually navigate those more difficult decision-making scenarios if and when they emerge. And this is contrasted to some of the other responses where people express frustration, I guess, about how their organisation seems to be reactive. You know, we have a root cause analysis procedure to investigate complaints or incidents, but wouldn't it be far better to do a review of client experience or customer experience after admission as a routine? That to me would help. And I think that's, again, talking to that idea of starting by understanding the person's experience and working out from there rather than waiting until something goes wrong. So I hope that helps to just give a little bit of context to the work that we've done about looking at these organisational policies, and that it might give you some ideas about approaches that you might take in terms of looking at supported decision making in the aged care sector. Coming out of this research, we've really seen the need to provide some guidance for the aged care sector, and so working with a series of advisory groups in Western Australia, South Australia and New South Wales, we've developed this policy guidelines document, and that aims to describe the national decision-making principles with specific attention for the factors relevant to aged care providers. So it has three main sections, and one of them is a self-assessment tool for aged care providers to assess their current policies, and that's exactly the same tool as what we used in the study that I just talked about, so it's freely available for self-assessment. And understanding that that's a part of the process, but there also needs to be a method for then having interactive discussions with staff about how this actually plays out in practice. So there's a case study which has some content to support a facilitated discussion with staff, perhaps in a handover meeting, or if there's a bit more time available in a longer reflective discussion. And finally, we provide a model policy framework. It's not a policy that can be copied and pasted, but it's really some guidance around the key considerations that you might want to take into account in reframing or updating current policy. And that's available on the project webpage, which is linked to just below there. So one of the things that I just wanted to point out there, and we've just become aware of this, is that this policy guidelines document has been endorsed by the Australian Aged Care Quality Agency, and they've included it in their resources relating to the new accreditation standards, particularly under standards 1 and 2. Unfortunately, there is, due to some recent shuffling of some of the numbers of the standards, you'll see if you go through this in detail that there are some of the numbers that don't quite match up to the sub-standards that were there at the time of publication, but we'll be releasing a new edition which updates that and an addendum to show where those have changed. So I'm just going to move on now. And, well, yeah, I guess this slide also talks to that point I was just making, but when you look at the new standards, and for those who aren't aware, the quality of care principles within the Aged Care Act is being amended at the moment, and we're going from a previous framework of 44 quality standards down to 8, which apply for all aged care providers, both community care, residential care, and also the flexible Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander models as well. And you can see here that some of these standards do talk very strongly to the principles around supported decision making. And so, for example, standard 1.2, which is actually now 1.3, is that each consumer is able to and supported as needed to exercise choice and independence around a range of important aspects of their care and lifestyle. So I think you can see through this that there is a sense of relevance to the incoming accreditation standards, and that could be another impetus for developing policy and also practice for aged care providers in supported decision making. So I'm just going to ask Helen now to make some comments based on her experience of being involved in the project, but also the next step of working with these policy guidelines, and how has that actually played out in the organisation, and what have you noticed through that process?
Hi again. The thing, well, I was really engaged with this topic because I've been so involved with the project, and in particular the policy review. But I'm just one person within the organisation. Where things for us really took off was at the launch of the policy document, this policy guideline, and when other people in the organisation read it. And it didn't take a lot to change people's hearts and minds towards this report. The senior staff in our organisation have really taken it on board. It seems to resonate with people because it's a rights-based approach, saying this is what people have a right to say. Because we work in an environment now where choice and control is so much a part of our policy requirements and directions. So the sharing this document more broadly, and with people having been to the launch and saying, hey, we need to find out more about this, that's what really started the journey for us as an organisation to implement it, as opposed to an organisation that was just involved in research. And I think for those of you who are listening to this webinar, this hopefully is a kickstart for you to say, how might we use this in our organisation? In Helping Hand, that meant sharing the work with our senior management and senior clinical leadership groups to gauge their interest. And they all came back saying, can we please have a copy of the guide, and when can we talk further about that? We've moved on now to say, rather than just talking about it and putting a book on the shelf for people to read, let's set up a group that will get together in a couple of weeks' time. Unfortunately, we have Craig to come and support us in this conversation, but to work through and say, well, how would we put this into practice? How can we develop a policy framework in our organisation in the way that we write policy and guidance, that we can then start putting this into practice? It's a bit of a top-down approach, if you like, starting by saying it's easier for, and it goes back to how organisations approach policy, which was talked about earlier, but having a framework in place that enables people to work within that, give people permission, staff permission to work in a certain way because it's now policy. We were one of the organisations that had supported decision-making references scattered through our documents. And it was looking at that made me think, hang on a minute, wouldn't it be easier if we just said overall for the organisation, let's say this is how decision-making is done here between our clients and their family members and other key stakeholders and ourselves, our own staff. And then it would just be given, we wouldn't have to rewrite it all the time. And we're moving down that path. We'll probably have, for the workshop we have with our staff and with Craig, a kind of start to a model based on the documents we've got, and also with the companion consumer guide, which is now also available on the websites, and Craig will give you more information about that, to use those sort of diagrams and directives. After that, we've got to turn it into practice, I guess, but hopefully an action plan will come out of that workshop. The other thing that we've been doing is working with a small group of carers and using the communication, the companion guide, to get their perspective on what supported decision making means and how they would use it. Even after just 2 sessions with this small group, they've come back with really interesting feedback about how they respond to it. One family grouping has been saying, we found we were starting, in that case it's a husband and two children, and they said we started talking around Lynn, who is the wife, rather than with her, and she knows that we're talking around her, and yet we thought we were doing really well in supporting her to make decisions. So they're going to start thinking about how they can work differently. The key messages out of this for us as an organisation, I guess what I should share with you, is that we need to develop guidelines and policy within the organisation to work for us and within our way of writing directives to our staff or frameworks to work within and guidelines. There's an instinctive willingness amongst particularly our leadership group that this is the right way to go, which is extraordinarily rewarding because it means that we're working with people who understand or believe instinctively in rights. The carers that we've spoken to so far love this approach and really want to engage with it. The key action, though, I think, coming from the carer group is that we need to build capacity of both people with dementia and their carers to work in this way. So it needs to be an organisational policy approach, a development of our staff approach, and capacity building of consumers and their carers, because this won't work if they don't know how to work with it as well. Thanks, Craig.
Thanks, Helen. Okay, so some really helpful insights there, and I think one of the things that often is an immediate response to something around supported decision making is that, well, what are the consequences of these decisions? And if a person does have a cognitive impairment, how do we ensure that risk is managed appropriately? So we'd just like to share a video here about that brings some views from a range of perspectives on enabling choice in the context of risk and how that might apply in the aged care setting. During this time, think about if you have any questions. We'll have a brief few comments on the video from our point of view, but very happy to answer questions following the video, and then we'll be wrapping up. So just going to run that video.
Supported decision making is an active engagement with someone. It's provision of information, but it's listening.
Each and every decision, a person with dementia needs to be given that opportunity in the first instance, rather than an assumption being made that that capacity isn't there.
We have a real issue in medicine today. If someone has a diagnosis of dementia, that is often assumed then that they cannot make decisions. The ability to make decisions is not an all or nothing thing. It's people have, if you like, a sliding scale of ability to make decisions when they have dementia. People with dementia do need support to make decisions, like all of us. They need some information, but it needs to be provided in a simple and clear way. They need to be able to ask questions about it, and often a stepwise approach is the best way to do it.
It's about giving the person with dementia the opportunity to express their wishes in the best possible situation.
I'm Ron Sinclair, and my wife was Diana. She got early onset familial dementia, Alzheimer's disease probably. For me, I struggled to know how to allow her to make certain decisions about what she was going to do and weigh out what the risks were. Risk isn't just to somebody's personal health and well-being, and it's not only financial risk.
Risk is everywhere. In our normal day-to-day lives, I still do remember that I could multitask. I could consider risk while I was considering other things. It was encompassed into my daily life. For me now, my thought processes are probably a bit different, and quite often the risk element doesn't come into play as often or as regularly as I wish it did. Sometimes I need some help for someone just to remind me that if I want to ride the horse, it's always a good idea for someone to be with me. Intuition just isn't quite what it used to be, so part of supported decision making in my daily life is things like that, reminding me of the little things that my brain no longer takes into consideration.
You know, we all know that a person with dementia does have an increased risk of unsteadiness on their feet, does have an increased risk of malnutrition. But if you start from there and go that way, you'll be coming up with a solution before you've actually understood who it is that you're caring for and what that person, how that person factors in to your decision-making process. And that's where knowing and understanding the person is key to looking at what does risk mean for an individual. because for one person's risk is another person's life. And being able to see that, know that, and enable and empower the people working with a person ensures that you're not bringing everybody into the mediocre.
Allowing people to make some decisions for themselves, even if there's risk involved, is really important. You can't live in cotton wool. You have to weigh up what are the costs and benefits here.
Focusing on building a story for a person with the person and the people who know them best gives us a better opportunity to enable that person within an environment and a care model that isn't about just your diagnosis.
I cared for my husband who had dementia. It was one of the more aggressive forms of dementia. He was very much like a free person, an independent thinker, and sometimes that freedom put him at great risk. And so we had to negotiate ways around that. And so that negotiation might be, let's talk about this another time, or wouldn't you prefer to go to a concert rather than climb the escarpment behind our property?
We lived at the end of a dirt track next to a national park, but she still, for a long time while she's still at home and could still walk, she wanted to walk in that park, and allowing her to do that, particularly when she wanted to do it on her own, I struggled with. But I knew, because of the person she was, that this was really, really important.
Providing good clinical care stems from knowing and understanding the person. It doesn't start the other way around. And through that process, clearly looking at what could go wrong. And not what could go wrong, therefore how do we stop it from going wrong. It's what could go wrong and what are your thoughts and beliefs that underpin, is that acceptable or not.
Don't be afraid. There's still plenty of enjoyment in life, and if we're talking about risks, there are risks out there, but face them, look at them, allow your person that you're looking after to help you make some decisions for both of you. They've got to be part of it.
Knowing and understanding the person is key to looking at what does risk mean for an individual, because for one person's risk is another person's life.
Okay, so that video I think does illustrate from a range of perspectives some of the considerations around risk. Now, for people who are coming in via the phone, you may not have heard the material there. Apologise for that. When you receive the recording, post the completion of the webinar, you will be able to watch the video as well. And it will also go up on the web page that I've been referring to. So I'd just like to ask some of our guests about your perspectives on some of the content in there. Kathy, what were your thoughts about risk there?
I think when providers and care providers are thinking, and even families and carers are thinking about risk, for me, that raised the issue about whose decision is it whether to take the risk. And I think it should be the person's decision. And, if people have cognitive impairment, for example, they need support to understand the risk, like we all do. We all in our lives might need to discuss a decision with somebody. What are the benefits? What are the risks? And then make a decision about whether we think we want to take that risk or not take that risk. And everyone has their own risk threshold. And I have another little story that I think I'll share. And this was about somebody who was in my mum's facility, and I'd go and have dinner with mum, and this woman would be at the dinner table, and she was quite frail. And every time I went there, she would take about 20 minutes to kind of get up out of her seat. She clearly wanted to go for a walk. And the saddest thing was that no one asked her whether she wanted to go for a walk or not. They would just basically help her sit down again, sit down, love. And I think, you know, if she had if her needs had been even if people had found out about her needs or asked her about her needs, she might have been supported to go for a walk rather than to be told to sit down. So I think really the risk lies with the person, but people with dementia or cognitive impairment need support to be able to understand. I think Teresa's point about need some support to understand what those risks might be, and then to support to be able to decide whether to take that risk or not.
Thanks. And Helen?
All right. There are a couple of things that came out of this for me. One was Ron's point, and I think who makes this as well, of negotiating the risk, and that the person with dementia or their family members and themselves work together to decide what was an acceptable risk, which goes to that point I think it's been made earlier as well by Sue Curl right in the introduction. Dementia is not an on-off switch. Just because you have a diagnosis doesn't mean that you therefore aren't able to make any decisions or choices. And those decisions around risk will be within that context that Kathy was talking about, of individually through our lives we've had an approach to risk, and we don't lose that just because we now have dementia. The other part was about how organisations approach risk, and we start with the worst case scenario and then work back from that, controlling that worst case scenario, instead of saying how do we understand this person, how do they make decisions, how can they be supported to understand the inputs that go into a decision, information and discussion around consequences and whatever, in the way that they can understand that, and that our approach to risk should be about supporting those conversations rather than saying there's this risk, we need to control it all the way down because we know something bad's going to happen when we actually don't.
Thanks, Helen.
So thank you.
So we have just a few minutes left, but if anyone has any questions that you'd like us to talk to, type them into your comments box and we'll see them come up here. Just while you're doing that, I'll just answer or respond to one of the questions, which was about how do you watch some of the previous webinars. So the link at the bottom of the screen here is the link to our project webpage, and it includes a range of the resources, but the first two webinars are already up there as recordings. So you can access them and go and watch them at your leisure. And then this one will be up there when we're able to get it prepared as well. And along with that, of course, the policy guidelines and the consumer guidebook, as well as the videos.
Someone's writing a question.
Okay, so it looks like we might have a question coming in. Don't be shy. We've got a few minutes.
Just while we're waiting, I think that I think the consumer guidelines for supported decision making are really important, and I think we all have levels of decision making ability, whether we have cognitive impairment or not. Some people make decisions in a really robust way. Some people just do stuff, and I think like Helen said before, this approach will only work if people's ability to make decisions is enabled, and I think the consumer guidelines are a really practical tool to help that happen.
Thanks, Kathy, and I think that does talk to one of the comments that's just come in. So I'll just read it out here. Family involvement is crucial for residents' care. We understand that, but expecting staff to do all the work alone is not enough with the shortage of staff in these facilities. Mindset of relatives has to change in order for this to work. I absolutely agree with that, and I think that's where we've been trying to create a diversity of resources so that that families can be using, for example, the consumer guidebook. It takes people through a process of how you can, or what you can consider in supporting a person's decision making. Some of the things that might seem very natural and second nature for some people, and some things that might be new information for some people as well. So yeah, I'd certainly agree with that point of view, and thanks for the comment. So we've just come up to 12 o'clock, and this, as I said, is the final in our webinar series. Thank you very much for joining us, and I've seen there's some people who've come in for a number of the sessions. It's been great to see you engaging that way. I hope it's been useful, and thanks again to Kathy Williams and Helen Levitch for joining us today, and to Redback for supporting the